When my own brother told me I wasn't welcome at the company anymore, I didn't shout. I just stood there, in the same office where our father's portrait hung, and realized how easy it was for people to forget who helped build their empire. That moment is burned into my memory like the scent of burnt coffee lingering after a stormy morning. I can still see the reflection of the harbor outside that wide glass window, the same harbor where our father started everything 40 years ago, with a single boat and a stubborn dream. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Catherine Langford, and until last year, I believed my family's company, Langford Marine and Supply, was our shared legacy. My father, John Langford, had built it from scratch, turning a small dockside repair shop into one of the most respected marine logistics companies on the East Coast. Everyone in Charleston knew the name. The Langfords were supposed to stand for trust, hard work, and loyalty. At least, that's what I thought. I was the middle child, not the loudest, not the favorite, but the steady one. My older brother David had always been groomed as the heir, while my younger sister Margaret drifted in and out of responsibility like the tide itself. Still, when our father passed 3 years ago, something unexpected happened. The will named all three of us as equal partners. Equal. For a brief, golden stretch of months, it felt like the family was finally working together. We had dinners in the big house on Church Street, the one with magnolia trees framing the porch and the smell of salt in the evening air. We toasted to the next generation over bourbon and laughter. David handled operations. I managed finance and client relations, and Margaret oversaw marketing. It worked, until it didn't. It started with small things you don't notice right away when you're too busy keeping the peace. David began showing up late to board meetings, his excuses growing thinner each time. Margaret stopped replying to emails about expense reports. Vendors started calling me directly, saying invoices were being delayed, contracts rewritten. When I'd ask for clarification, David would wave his hand dismissively and say, "Don't worry about it, Kathy. I've got it under control." But I did worry, because that's who I am. My father used to tell me, "A ship doesn't sink because of the water around it, sweetheart. It sinks because of the water that gets inside." And lately, it felt like water was seeping in fast. At first, I tried to fix things quietly. I stayed late after everyone left, double-checking ledgers, balancing accounts, flagging discrepancies. I told myself it was just growing pains, a family learning to run a business without its patriarch. But deep down, something colder was stirring. A quiet dread. Then came the first real crack. One humid afternoon, I was in the office kitchen when I overheard David's voice coming from his corner office. His tone was sharp, anxious the way it gets when he's lying. "She doesn't need to know about this. Just sign the damn contract before she sees the numbers." My breath caught. I stood frozen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence that followed. He was talking to someone, probably our new CFO, Evan Reese, a slick young man David had hired a few months earlier, without consulting me. I wanted to walk in, confront him, but instead, I walked out to the balcony, the same spot where our father used to smoke his pipe and talk about legacy. The air was heavy, with the scent of rain and salt. I remember looking down at the docks, men hauling crates, engines groaning the sound of honest work. And I wondered when we had stopped being honest. That night, I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Family deserved the benefit of the doubt. But the next morning, when I opened my email, I found something that made my hands go cold. A notice from the State Business Registry. Articles of amendment filed for Langford Marine and Supply, effective immediately. Board structure adjusted. Catherine Langford removed as managing partner. I stared at it for a full minute, heart pounding so loud I could hear it echo in my ears. I thought it had to be a mistake. I even laughed, a short, broken laugh that felt too dry to be real. But when I stormed into David's office, I found him sitting behind our father's mahogany desk, calm as ever. "David," I said, my voice shaking. "What is this?" He barely looked up. "You were overcomplicating things, Kathy. Evan and I decided it'd be best if one person handled decision-making. Less confusion." "Less confusion?" I repeated. "You mean less accountability?" He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose like I was a child, throwing a tantrum. "Don't make this emotional. It's business." But it wasn't just business. It was betrayal, and it was personal. The argument that followed wasn't loud. It was quiet, seething, the kind where every word carries 10 years of buried resentment. When I accused him of forging the board vote, he smiled faintly and said, "You'll thank me later." That was the day I packed my things and walked out. I didn't slam doors or curse. I just left my keycard on his desk right next to our father's old fountain pen and walked through the lobby for the last time. As I stepped outside, the sky opened up. Rain poured down in sheets, And I didn't even run for cover. I let it soak me, wash the bitterness off my skin, because somehow, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. The weeks after I left the company felt like waking up from a long fever. Everything looked the same: the streets of Charleston, the pale blue shutters on the old houses, the sound of church bells echoing through the afternoon, but I wasn't the same woman walking through them. For the first time in years, I had no reason to check my email at dawn. No conference calls, no vendor complaints, just silence, heavy, unkind silence that filled my kitchen every morning with the smell of cold coffee and regret. People whispered, of course. Charleston has a way of spreading stories faster than wind off the harbor. At the farmer's market, old business associates would glance at me with that polite, pitying smile. Some even dared to say, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, Catherine." Others avoided eye contact altogether, like failure was contagious. I didn't bother correcting them. I let them believe whatever version David had fed the town, that I'd decided to take a step back, that I wanted to focus on family. But at night, when I sat by my window watching the ships drift across the water, I thought of all the late nights I'd spent helping my father balance the books, every signature I'd fought for, every meeting I'd held together when David was too busy golfing or entertaining investors at the yacht club. I had helped build that company, and they had erased me in a single document. Still, a small part of me hoped irrationally that they'd realize their mistake, that David would call, voice softened, and say, "Come back, Kathy. We need you." But he never did. Then, about a month later, I ran into Evan Reese at a charity gala downtown. One of those polished events with champagne that tastes like coins and conversations that mean nothing. He was standing by the bar, laughing with a group of donors, wearing that same smug smile I remembered from board meetings. When his eyes met mine, the laughter drained just a little. He excused himself and walked over. "Catherine," he said, as if the sound of my name was a mild inconvenience. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I replied. "You look comfortable. Guess you're settling in at the company." He gave a little smirk. "We're doing just fine. Actually, better than before. Streamlined operations, new partnerships. David's been making smart moves." There was a sharpness beneath his tone, a kind of arrogance that tasted familiar. The kind that comes from people who think they've already won. So I smiled. "I'm glad. My father would have wanted it to thrive." He raised his glass, almost mockingly. "Your father was a visionary. We're just modernizing his vision." And then, like all good villains in disguise, he leaned in slightly and whispered, "It's a shame you couldn't keep up." For a split second, the air between us froze. I felt something inside me, that steady, quiet loyalty, flicker into something else. Something colder. I didn't respond. I just turned, walked out of the ballroom, and into the warm Charleston night. But that was the moment I stopped hoping they'd come around. That was the night I decided to stop mourning and start paying attention. The next few weeks, I began hearing murmurs. Subtle at first: a contractor who hadn't been paid, a supplier complaining that David was restructuring payments, whispers of missing funds. I didn't go looking for gossip. But in Charleston, news floats to you whether you want it or not. One afternoon, I met Tom Richards, a retired accountant who used to manage some of our older accounts. He stopped me at the bakery on Broad Street and said quietly, "Catherine, have you talked to David lately?" I shook my head. "No." "Why?" He hesitated, looking around before lowering his voice. "Because something's off. I got a call from one of your old clients. They said their invoices are being rerouted through a shell company, R&R Holdings. Ever heard of it?" My stomach twisted. "No." "Well," Tom said, straightening his glasses, "I did a little digging. Turns out, R&R Holdings is registered under a single name, Evan Reese." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was so predictably crooked, the kind of scheme David would have walked right into, blinded by greed and flattery. "Thank you, Tom," I said softly. "You didn't hear this from me, all right?" He nodded. "Just be careful, Catherine. They're playing with fire." That night, I pulled out the old laptop I hadn't opened since leaving the company. I still had copies of our early ledgers, the ones from before David took over. I spent hours comparing numbers, tracing old contracts, looking for patterns. It was like watching a clean painting get smeared with mud. There were discrepancies everywhere: inflated expenses, false vendor names, even missing shipment records. It wasn't just incompetence. It was deliberate. And the worst part? My brother was signing off on all of it. By midnight, I sat there staring at the evidence, the glow of the screen washing my face pale. I didn't feel rage. Not anymore. I felt heartbreak. The quiet kind that seeps through your bones when you realize someone you love chose deceit over decency. My father used to say, "Greed's a tide, Kathy. It doesn't come all at once. It rises slowly until you realize you're already underwater." And I could see it now. The tide had reached their throats. The next morning, I printed everything: spreadsheets, contracts, fake vendor logs, and sealed them in a brown envelope. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch the family name drown in corruption. A few days later, I got an invitation in the mail. An embossed letter with the Langford Marine logo. Quarterly Partners Banquet, hosted by David Langford. My name had been removed from the partner list, but apparently not from the mailing system. I stared at that invitation for a long time, and then I smiled. That banquet would be my moment. Not for revenge, but for truth. The banquet was held at the Charleston Yacht Club, the same place where my father used to host charity galas back when Langford Marine stood for something honorable. I hadn't set foot in that building since the funeral, and stepping into it again felt like walking through a ghost of my past. The air smelled faintly of cedar and champagne, laughter echoing against the polished wood walls. Everyone looked immaculate: men in tailored suits, women in pearls, the kind of crowd that knows how to smile for cameras while whispering behind crystal glasses. I stood in the corner for a while, unnoticed. That's the thing about being cast out. People forget how to see you. When David finally spotted me across the room, his jaw tightened for a second before he composed himself and smiled. He crossed the floor with his glass raised, voice syrupy smooth. "Well, if it isn't my little sister," he said, kissing my cheek like a politician, greeting a donor. "Didn't expect to see you tonight." I smiled back, steady. "I still got the invitation." He chuckled. "Must have been a clerical mistake. But since you're here, enjoy yourself. Tonight's about celebration, not old wounds." "Right," I said, looking him square in the eye. "Celebration." He didn't notice the envelope in my hand. Not yet. After the speeches and the rounds of applause, when the crowd had settled into that comfortable hum of chatter and ego, I walked toward the small stage near the center of the room, the same place my father once stood when he announced the expansion of the company. I still remember his voice that day, full of pride. I cleared my throat softly into the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I began, calm and collected. The room fell into a curious hush. David froze mid-conversation, his smile slipping just slightly. "I know most of you weren't expecting me tonight," I said, glancing around. "But I wanted to take a moment to honor my father and everything he built. Because when he started Langford Marine and Supply, it wasn't just a business. It was a promise. A promise to serve this city with integrity." A few polite nods, a few uncomfortable glances. "And I believe," I continued, "that promise deserves to be protected, especially from those who would profit off his name while betraying his legacy." A ripple moved through the crowd. David's face flushed. "Catherine," he muttered under his breath, walking toward the stage, his tone controlled but sharp. "That's enough." I ignored him. In the past 6 months, there have been irregularities. Financial, ethical, and moral. I have evidence that funds were diverted through shell companies, that employees were misled, that our family's reputation is being used to launder greed. Gasps, murmurs, the kind of silence that feels like static in the air. David climbed the step, whispering, "What the hell are you doing?" I turned to him, voice low but firm, telling the truth. Then I held up the envelope. "Every document, every transaction, every signature is here. I've already sent copies to the board and the authorities. Tonight isn't about revenge, David. It's about accountability." He tried to snatch the papers from me, but I stepped back, letting the microphone catch his hiss of frustration, a sound that didn't need translation. That's when I saw Evan standing near the exit, pale as the tablecloths. He slipped out quietly like a rat, leaving a sinking ship. The rest of the evening blurred into chaos, people whispering, phones buzzing, a few walking out, others staring at me like I'd dropped a bomb in the middle of their polite dinner. But I didn't feel shame. I felt relief. For the first time in months, I could breathe. I left before the night ended. The rain had started again, a slow drizzle against the pavement. I stood by the harbor for a long time, the scent of wetwood and sea salt filling the air, watching the dark waves swallow the lights reflected from the club windows. I thought about my father again, how proud he'd been of us, how much he'd trusted us to protect what he built. I whispered to the wind, "I did what you'd want, Daddy." I told the truth. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks, Langford Marine was under formal investigation. The local papers ran the story with headlines that made me sick to my stomach. Family empire under fire. Allegations of fraud at Langford Marine. David went silent. Margaret, ever the peacemaker, called me once, her voice trembling. Kathy, what did you do? What I had to, I said. They're saying you ruined us. No, I said quietly. David and Evan did that themselves. There was a long pause, then a whisper. He's been crying, you know. Says you betrayed him. I closed my eyes. He betrayed himself. I didn't hate her for taking his side, she always had. But I could hear something new in her voice that day. Fear. The company's accounts were frozen. Investors pulled out. Clients withdrew contracts. And the cherry on top, Evan Reese vanished completely, leaving behind empty offices and offshore accounts the auditors couldn't trace. The empire that had taken 40 years to build collapsed in less than 6 months. One afternoon, I went to the docks where it all began. The old boatyard was quiet, the water calm. The air smelled like oil and salt, a scent that somehow always felt like home. An elderly worker named Hank, who'd known my father for decades, looked up as I approached. Didn't think I'd see you back here, Miss Catherine, he said with a kind smile. Guess I needed to see it for myself, I replied. He nodded toward the empty slip, where the flagship vessel used to dock. It's a shame, but your daddy raised you right. He'd be proud you stood your ground. His words settled something inside me, something that had been restless for too long. That night, I went home and sat by the window, looking out over the same harbor lights that once symbolized ambition. Now they just looked peaceful. The storm had passed. The water was still. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't drowning in it. In the months that followed, Charleston buzzed with the fall of the Langfords. It was like watching a southern dynasty unravel, piece by piece, under the weight of its own secrets. People who once lined up to shake my brother's hand now crossed the street to avoid him. Vendors who used to send him holiday baskets now demanded back payments. The same polished businessmen who once toasted to our family legacy whispered behind closed doors about fraudulent dealings and federal investigations. The Langford name had once been written in gold across the harbor skyline. Now, it was printed in black ink across every newspaper headline. And as for me, I stayed quiet. Not out of guilt, out of peace. I spent those months in a small cottage near the edge of the city, a place my father had bought decades ago but rarely used. It overlooked the marshlands, wide stretches of green and gold that caught the evening sun in a way that made everything look like forgiveness. Every morning, I'd walk down to the dock with my coffee, breathing in the scent of salt and pine. There were no boardrooms, no spreadsheets, no bitter arguments, just the creak of the wooden boards and the soft hum of life returning to something simple. But every so often, I'd hear whispers about David. He'd been questioned by investigators. His assets were frozen. The company was in liquidation. He was seen less and less around town. No more tailored suits. No more yacht club dinners. Just quiet disappearances and the occasional sighting at a local diner where he'd sit alone in a corner booth, staring out the window. Part of me wanted to reach out, to ask if he was okay. But another part, the older, wiser part, knew that some lessons can only be learned through loss. One rainy afternoon, about 6 months after the banquet, I got a letter. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Kathy, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say you were right. About everything. I thought I was protecting Dad's legacy by keeping control. I told myself you'd slow things down, that you didn't understand the new market. But truth is, I was afraid. Afraid you'd do it better. Afraid you already were. Evan's gone. He took more than money. He took what little pride I had left. But maybe he did me a favor. I can finally see what I became. If you ever decide to rebuild, I hope you'll use the Langford name for something good again. Something honest. Something Dad would have been proud of. David. I read that letter 3 times, each word heavy and tender at once. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. Just sadness, because beneath all the pride and ambition, David had only ever wanted what I wanted to make our father proud. He'd just lost himself along the way. That night, I lit a candle by the window and whispered a prayer for him. Not for redemption that wasn't mine to give, but for peace. Spring came to Charleston like a soft apology. The azaleas bloomed again, bright pink and white, against the iron gates of old houses. The air smelled of new rain and fresh beginnings. I'd started consulting quietly for smaller, local businesses, family-owned ones like ours used to be, before ambition poisoned it. I helped them set up fair contracts, transparent accounting, ethical partnerships. Every time I watched a young couple sign their first business license, I saw a little piece of what my father built and what I had fought to protect. One afternoon, a man approached me outside a cafe. "Miss Langford?" he asked. "Yes? I used to work for your company. Warehouse division. Lost my job when everything fell apart." I nodded slowly, unsure where he was going. He smiled faintly. "I just wanted to thank you. I know it couldn't have been easy, what you did. But you saved a lot of us. The truth coming out meant we weren't blamed for what they did. You gave some of us a chance to work again." I didn't know what to say. I just reached out and shook his hand. And for the first time since everything collapsed, I felt something like closure. A few months later, I visited the old Langford headquarters, now boarded up, the glass dusty, the sign half faded. I stood outside for a long while, watching the light flicker against the worn gold letters. Langford Marine and Supply. It didn't hurt anymore. It just felt like the end of a chapter. Inside, through the dusty glass, I could still see our father's portrait hanging behind the front desk. He was smiling that same quiet, proud smile he always had when things were still simple. "I kept the promise, Daddy," I whispered. "Maybe not the business, but the truth." And that was enough. Later that evening, I walked along the harbor again, the sun dipping low, turning the water to molten gold. The air smelled like salt and jasmine. Somewhere, a church bell rang. I thought about legacy, how it's not the money you leave behind, but the principles you stand for when everything else is stripped away. I thought about how, sometimes, losing everything isn't a punishment. It's freedom. Because when my family kicked me out of the business, I thought they'd taken my identity with it. But they hadn't. They'd just forced me to remember who I was before the company, before the numbers, before the titles. I was my father's daughter, steady, honest, and unbreakable. The tide was rolling in, soft waves brushing against the dock. I sat there for a while, feet dangling above the water, letting the wind play through my hair. The city lights shimmered across the bay, reflections bending and reforming like the past itself. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix anything. I didn't feel anger or regret, just calm. Because sometimes, the greatest victories are the quiet ones, the ones where you walk away with your dignity intact. They say time heals all wounds, but I've learned that's not quite true. Time doesn't heal, it reveals. It shows you what was real and what was only illusion. It strips away the noise, the pride, the excuses, until all that's left is the truth you were too afraid to face before. For me, that truth was simple. Family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty and love. Love without respect will always turn into pain. My brother, David, wasn't evil. He was lost, trapped in the same illusion that built our empire. That success means power, and power means worth. But when that illusion shattered, I finally saw him not as my rival, not as the man who betrayed me, but as my brother, standing knee-deep in the ruins of everything he thought made him strong. And in that moment, I forgave him. Not because he asked for it, but because I needed peace more than I needed revenge. A few weeks ago, I visited my father's grave for the first time in years. The headstone was simple. Thomas Langford, builder, dreamer, father. I knelt down and brushed away the leaves. "I think I finally understand what you meant," I whispered. "About legacy, about integrity." The wind moved through the oak trees like a soft sigh, and for a moment, I swear I felt him there, not as a ghost, but as a presence, calm and proud. I closed my eyes and smiled, because I finally realized my father's legacy was never the company. It was me. And so, if you ever find yourself standing where I once stood, torn between what's easy and what's right, between family and truth, I hope you choose what your heart can live with. Because money fades, names fade, but what you build with honesty, that lasts. Maybe you'll lose people, maybe you'll lose everything for a while. But one day, when the noise fades and the dust settles, you'll look in the mirror and finally see yourself again. And that, my friend, is worth more than all the gold in Charleston Harbor. My name is Catherine Langford, and this was the story of how I lost my family, but found myself again. If you want to hear more true, soul-deep stories like this of family, betrayal, and redemption, visit my channel and listen to the full story there. Subscribe for more stories that'll stay with your heart long after the screen goes dark.